It's really my pleasure today to introduce author Jane Kirkpatrick. She's a New York Times bestselling author. Her works have appeared in more than 50 national publications, including the Oregonian, Private Pilot, and Daily Guideposts. She has more than 1.5 million books in print. And we really are excited about having her here today. After her presentation, we do have cookies and coffee out in the Galleria. We invite you to come over and talk to us a little bit more. And then Ms. Kirkpatrick will be signing books as well. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you all for coming and bearing the weather. I did think about Tabitha Moffett Brown, of course, who is the mother of Oregon, that I'm going to spend a little time talking with about today, and realizing that this is the kind of weather that she had in December and October, and when they were in the southern Oregon area on the Applegate cutoff. So, and eventually lost the wagon, and other tragedies occurred. So she's the one that. Can you hear me all right? Do I have to hold this better? This sounds looks sort of profound, doesn't it? And now it's the hearing room here. So anyway, I think about that, and when I start to get whiny about my feet got cold or it got rainier, then I thought I just remember Tabitha Moffett Brown and her family and all the other wonderful historical women that I get to write about who didn't have the luxury of a heated seat in their car, which is really decadent. So, but I love that. So I am delighted that you're here. And how many of you know who the father of Oregon is? Shout it out. McLaughlin, John McLaughlin. And the mother of Oregon, of course, is Tabitha Moffett Brown. They were in different decades, so I always say I don't think any hanky-pank was going on there between the mother and the father of Oregon. And Tabitha's photograph, as well as one of John McLaughlin, is here in the governor's office. Those two, the mother and the father of Oregon. Tabitha is one of 6 women, along with 150 some men who are listed in various places around the rotunda, their names as Great Oregonians. Another one of the women who is listed is Marie Dorian. And Marie Dorian was the only woman who came with the Astor expedition, which was the first big expedition after Lewis and Clark went back. She was an Iowa Indian woman, and she came with her husband, 60 men, and 2 little boys. And she remained here in the Northwest, and the story of her life is really quite wonderful. And she's actually buried in the French Prairie area of our state, and west of Woodburn. She was when she was alive, and then was buried. The church, she was buried beneath the altar of the little Catholic church. There is a little Catholic church there, but it's not in the actual site where it was when she was there. But there's a memorial to her there. So she's considered a great Oregonian, and her name is there as well. So I'm here to basically tell you some stories today, because that's what I do, but that's also what you all do too, because stories are the most powerful way we have of organizing human experience. D.H. Lawrence said the stories tell us who we are and who we will become. And when William Faulkner accepted the Pulitzer Prize in 1954, he said the only stories worth the writer's blood and sweat and tears were stories of the human heart in conflict with itself. Willa Cather, who also won the Pulitzer, she said that the stories that engage us as adults are based on the experiences that we had before we turned 15. So people who are writing for children and young adults are I think, some of the best writers writing today. And a lot of times people have approached me and said, I used to love to read, but, life got complicated, and now I just, haven't gotten into it, and I'd like to get back into it because I really enjoyed a good book and getting lost in a good book. And they'll ask for recommendations, and I tell them to go to the Capitol Bookstore, or your local library, but look for the Caldecott winners and the Newbery winners, because those are the people who are writing for children and are receiving awards for that. Because kids, they won't give you 300 pages to tell your story. They want the essence of that story, and it kind of bypasses that critical side of us if you read a good children's book, and realize how touching they can be. And probably every one of us could identify a children's book from our childhood that continues to resonate in our lives because of the power of those stories. So I write a lot about women and historical women, actually women who lived, and I have to say that researching them is always sort of a challenge, because I can always find out more about their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, and their sons than I can about them. Virginia Woolf said that women's history must be invented, both uncovered and made up. And so that's part of what I find myself doing. There'll be some sort of interesting little tidbit that will happen, and I'll think, I wonder how that happened. And that's what gets me started, is some unanswered question about a particular person or a particular time in history or an event in history. One of the series of books that I wrote about was about the Oregon Trail, but it wasn't about the specific women. It was about a diary entry from Ezra Meeker in 1852, and he said, "Today we met 11 wagons headed back east." Where is east? That way, I think. All driven by women, their husbands having died and been buried on the trail. And I remember where I was when I read that, and I thought, wow, what do you think happened? And I was telling Jerry about it, and I would tell my women friends that I was thinking about writing about this, trying to explore what happened and what was going on, and at what point did they know they really couldn't go home again, and all this sort of stuff. And I would tell my women friends, and they would all speculate with me. And I would tell my men friends, and they would look at me with that deer in the headlight look and say, "You want to write a book about all the men dying? Who would read that book?" And so women buy about 85% of the books, but men make 85% of the publishing decisions about what gets published. So I did a lot of thinking about how I would approach trying to convince somebody that this is a good story. And I decided that it was a story about the Oregon Trail, but it was also about when we get bad news in life, we want to turn around and go back. When somebody says, "I don't love you anymore," or we get that call in the night, or maybe a diagnosis, we would like to have yesterday back. And it's the mark of our character how we allow other people to help sustain us and support us in what I call the wilderness places of our lives until we can find a new direction. So that series came out, and a group of quilters in Raleigh Hills, I think they called themselves the Quilt Worms, they read that book, and then they quilted their version of that story. And I had them come to a signing, and they held up their big king-size quilts and their table runners, and one of them made this one, and then she later gave it to me, and I just want to share it with you because I think it speaks so much to the Oregon Trail and the pioneering spirit in all of us. So this is, her name was Sharon Guthrie, and she said, "You know, those Oregon Trail stories, they really are depressing." She said, they're about children died and they had to bury them with no marker and run the wagons over there, or it's about what all these, the things they couldn't bring with them, or the things that had to be dumped out because they couldn't make the next grade. And she said, "What I like about your books is that they're based on not what people were leaving behind, but what they were going toward." And to me, that is the spirit of the Oregon. That's the Oregon spirit, is that we're always going toward something. It's not just that we were moving away from something, but we were moving toward. So she designed this to kind of be looking out the back of the wagon. And I held this up. I've held this up in Europe at different times, talking about the power of stories in our lives. And I always thought she was looking out the back because the mountains were behind her. But one time I held it up, I think it was in Sorrento or someplace, and I thought, oh, no, she could be looking out the front, because there are always more mountains, right? There are always more things to help us discover who we really are in those times of trial. So today I thought I would tell you Tabitha's story by talking about 5 words, because I love words. I'm really addicted to words, as you can imagine. And one of my favorite words is actually aghast. I would like you to say that word, aghast. Isn't that a great guttural aghast? And I always thought, I would never be able to use that word because it's kind of like what would be in a steamy romance novel or something, you know. She gazed at him aghast or whatever. And so I didn't write those kinds of books. But we had this dog. We called her Mrs. Butterworthless. Because if you left the butter uncovered, she would get it. Her name was Josie, and so one day I was sick and she came down the steps, and I know she thought everybody was outside, but I was on the couch, and I heard the chair scrape, and I heard her little nails, you know, get herself up like she was scanning the table looking for the butter, and when she got right across from me, I said, Josie, and her eyes got big and her ears went up and she looked aghast. And so now I can use that word. So when you see that in my books, I want you to think about Josie, yes. But I wanted to share with you just 5 words that I think are essential words for the Tabitha Moffett Browns of Oregon, but also of our own ancestry. 3 of these words were actually identified by a nurse who in the 1980s wanted to know why some people who lived through a really hard time and had a lot of struggles, as they got older, actually were people that we admired, and they were like mentoring people. And then other people who had maybe the same kinds of trials, they just got old and cranky. And she was trying to identify what is it that gives us that sense of hardiness, and I actually call it endurance. And so 3 of those are from that research and that I found in my own research with these incredible women. And then I've added 2 more. So I just want to, and they all start with the letter C, so that should help you remember it. And it helps me remember it, so I can tell you about it. And the first word starts with the letter C is the word commitment. And commitment is, if any of these histories and any of your own family histories of people that you have come to admire in your ancestry, there's almost always that occasion in which they made a commitment and they knew how to keep it. And it wasn't always for themselves, but usually for something larger than themselves. The word commitment comes from the banking industry, and it means to make a deposit against which you can later draw. It's a first century term. And how many of you remember Sully Sullenberger, from who landed his plane? I saw an interview with him after all of that happened, and he said, every landing I made was a deposit for one huge withdrawal on that day in January. And I think sometimes we don't realize how much of our lives are making little deposits towards those commitments. Maybe it's, to get your kids raised and out of the house. Maybe it's, to go back to school at some point, but you set aside doing that until these other things are taken care of. And what we know about Tabitha Moffett Brown was that she had been widowed as a young mother in New England in the 1840s or 1820s, and then she came to St. Charles, Missouri. She had endured a number of challenges at that time. She was also had a childhood accident that left her lame, so she used a walking stick to walk. And then in 1845, her adult son, Horace Brown, incidentally, all of her children had really unusual names. So Horace, maybe because of that Brown, they wanted to distinguish themselves or something. But so Horace had come out to Oregon and had found the Tuolumne, West Tuolumne Plains of what became Forest Grove, and felt like that was the promised land. And so he was gone for 2 years, made his way back, and in 1845 he convinced his brother and his brother-in-law, the Pringle family from this area, that they should all go west. They should come to Oregon. But he didn't think that Tabitha, his mother, could make it because she was old. She was 66 then. And she was old, and she was lame. And you had to walk on the Oregon Trail. You didn't really ride in those wagons. They were terrible for your back and so on. And they were doing that, I believe, for her best interest, but she decided something different. And she made a commitment to not be a burden on them, but she wanted to go herself. And so she hired her own wagon and driver and talked her 78-year-old brother-in-law into going with her. And they headed out. And as the story goes, Horace, who was with that same party, he sort of got ahead of them by a couple of weeks. And Manthano, who was another son, decided not to leave Missouri. So Tabitha and her brother-in-law were in the wagon train with the Pringle family and several others. And when they got to Fort Hall, the Applegate brothers came up from the south and had a new route that they suggested that they take, the Applegate Cutoff. This was being done in part because we were about to, the treaty between the British government and Oregon Territory was had to be renegotiated. And so, the British were right across the river, in what's now Vancouver and so on. And the only way to get back to the United States was to go along the Columbia. And so they were, the Applegate brothers, I believe, were looking for another route that would take them south, wouldn't require going that close to the British, and would actually be able to, people could get back to the States if they needed to. The sad thing was that they thought that it would, they had brought horses on it, but they'd never brought any wagons on it. But they really thought that they had enough equipment and people could just chop their way through. But in fact, that was not the case. And so it was a very disastrous journey. And it was really, I think, Tabitha's commitment to her family, and to sort of, not just to survive, but she and her brother-in-law were in a very precarious situation and did have to make a decision about, who's going to go and leave the others to have what food that's left. And the rest is sort of history. But she became the mother of Oregon for what she did after she was 66, for what she did after she made it out here. Because her other huge commitment was to education and to caring for those less fortunate, or the orphans that were on the trail. So the man who climbed Mount Everest, what's his name? Hillary? Yes. So he has this quote, and it sounds a lot like Van Goethe's quote, so I may mix the two of them up. But he said, what people don't realize is that once you make a commitment to something, then providence moves, and things begin to happen that you otherwise never could have imagined. So I can't believe that she ever imagined that she would be one of the founding members of Pacific University, or that she would one day be named the Mother of Oregon. But it was this commitment to persevere, to be with family, and to not be a burden on others, but to, in fact, let her generous heart take care of others. The second word that seems to fit with people who are very hardy and resilient is the word control. And most of the people who continue to endure know what they have control over and what they don't have control over. And they don't spend a lot of time in blame and accusation of either of themselves, or when things go wrong, it's like, if only you had done this, if only I had done that. Not because they couldn't win their lawsuit, but because when you spend time in blame and accusation, it keeps you from your commitments. It keeps you from moving forward. There are always a couple of things that we can do when we feel like the world is out of control, whether it's government, or it's our family, or it's our employers or employees. And one is, and these also start with the letter C, one is to get very clear about what matters in our lives. It's kind of looking back at that commitment, what really matters. And then having the courage to act on that. And then another little corollary with that same part about control is that when things are going rough and it's kind of chaotic, to ask ourselves to get curious. Increase our curiosity. Why is this happening? Why have I survived 5 earthquakes? Perhaps it's because of where I'm living, but get curious about, what's going on. And the other is to increase our compassion, not just for the other person, but for ourselves, because we're pretty hard on ourselves as human beings, and we make a lot of critical statements. And that's one of the things I think that Tabitha, in reading about her and reading the things that she had written, the letters that we still have of hers, and what other people wrote about her, is that she didn't waste a lot of time in whose fault was it that the wagon broke? Whose fault was it that, she didn't spend a lot of time saying, well, if only I had stayed at home, this is my own fault. Instead, she looked at, okay, how are we going to get through this? And what needs to happen next. And so she was constantly finding a new way, getting curious. They arrived in Salem December 24th, or December 25th, when they had been expected since October. Everybody was pretty destitute. They'd had some relief parties that had gone out to provide rescue food for them because they hadn't come through that whole party. And the resources that they thought they'd have to make a living here, they didn't have anymore because they had to eat their stock just to survive. And so here was Tabitha Moffett Brown, little tiny woman, not quite 5 feet tall, probably weighed 90 pounds, wet, trying to figure out how she was going to make a living and not be a burden. And she had had a pair of gloves, and this is the story that people in Forest Grove tell over and over, which is really delightful. She had a pair of gloves. She thought there was a stone in there or some kind of a button, and it bugged her. But eventually, she finally took the time to sort of peel that glove open, and it was a sixpence. It was money. It was currency, which was unusual in Oregon country because it was such a trade-related place. And so she took that sixpence and bought 3 needles with it, and then she traded some of the clothes that she still had on her back that when her wagon broke down, she piled a lot of clothes on herself to save as much as she could. She took some of that and traded it with some of the Kalapuya Indian women who had leather that was tanned, and she turned that into making gloves, which is what Oregon needed. And that began her seed money for eventually owning a lot of property, and much of which she gave, the money that she made, she gave back, and starting an orphanage and working for free and doing all kinds of things. She was very generous. She kept constantly giving things back. Dr. Carl Menninger, who's a famous psychiatrist, I used to be a mental health director, so I spent time with mental health related issues. But he said the single most important indicator of a person's mental health is generosity, that generous people are rarely mentally ill. So when you get a chance to give away some of your money, think of it as therapy, not as you're being constrained. So the third word is challenge. And what we've discovered with people who are very hardy and resilient is that they don't see a challenge as a mistake. They see it as new information for them to decide what they need to do next. I think it's why people who are very successful as entrepreneurs, it's not because they didn't make mistakes, it's just they didn't let those mistakes define who they were. I just want to read you a short little thing about what I imagined Tabitha might have said about challenge. She was a teacher, and that was really important to her. And part of the format of this book is that she's writing her memoir for her grandchildren, hoping that she can let them know about some of the challenges and how she dealt with them. So this is what she says about one of them. She said, Webster tells us a challenge is a call to engage in a contest or a claim to question truth or fact. But here is an oddity. The word comes from the Latin word calvi, meaning to deceive. I've thought often of what that word root, to deceive. I've decided that to refuse to accept a challenge is the deception. To let one's heart hesitate so long the challenge is missed, that forms the trickery. To resist our calling, whatever that may be, to keep our feet planted in one place rather than use them to go forward, or from fear to fail to spread our wings, that perhaps is the greatest cheating of any of our lives. What a deception it would be to turn our backs on what we're called to do, discovering our purpose. For within that action of acceptance of our worthiness for service comes our greatest joy. So, most of us wish we didn't have challenges. We wish that life just went smoothly. But chances are, if I asked you to turn and talk to someone about a time when you were personally strong, you would tell a story about a time when you had a challenge and how you overcame it. Because the word character comes to us from the Greek, and it means to chisel. And that suggests that it's what's left after we have had challenges, after we've been gouged out, that really is our character. I think that's personally why I don't like soap operas, because those characters have a lot of trouble, don't they? but they don't learn anything from their trauma. And they have no gouges. They all look really, smooth-skinned, and so, yes, they're beautiful people. But they're in the hospital a lot. Have you noticed that? Hospital a lot, so terrible things happen to them. But so the other thing that I think Tabitha shows us is that when you are facing a challenge, one of the first things you can do to yourself is say, wait a minute, get clear about what matters, and recommit to that commitment. Go back and say, what was this about? When I get a really bad review and I get them, and sadly I can still remember some of the words that are used in those bad reviews, I have to remind myself, wait a minute, I didn't do this to get great reviews. I didn't write this story or want to tell this story, to make a lot of money, because writing doesn't make a lot of money. Although this young lady over here just got her first royalty check of $111. Yes. But we can go back to that commitment. And my commitment was to tell the stories I've been given the best way I know how, and to trust that I'm not alone in the telling. And if I do that, then whatever happens is beyond my control, and I can just start the next book. So the fourth word is community. And Tabitha Moffett Brown and her daughter Fern and her granddaughter Virgilia, another interesting name, and Cerelia, who's another granddaughter, I love these names, they basically formed a community on the wagon train, which is what happened to most of the people. And when community didn't happen, you get the Donner Party. That was an example of where things did not gel, and as a result, people couldn't find a way to help support each other, and that did happen with the Applegate cutoff, with the Tabitha Moffett Brown's bypass. The word community is made up of COM and the word unity, and COM is actually from the Latin, and when you attach it to different words like community, communion, communication, it actually means the exchange of burdens. And I think that's really a lovely image for what a community is. That there are times when people in this, in this era, but even in our era, I used to think that the people who were really strong and hardy were the ones who went up to Alaska or the Yukon and lived with the elements and never saw anybody. But as I've gotten older, I think, no, the really resilient people are the ones who live next door to someone who didn't vote the way you voted. Someone who might need something that you have, but you just cannot believe that they think the way they think. And so the ability to exchange burdens, despite that, to me, is the sign of a true community. And that, to me, is also part of the pioneering spirit of Oregon. And then the last word is what I call coping. And my husband and I, in the 1980s, took a big plunge. We left our jobs in Bend, and we moved to what I called Rattlesnake and Rock Ranch. It was 160 acres on the lower John Day River east of the Dalles, about 52 miles, which is where we did our grocery shopping. And so we made this decision to go there. And, I thought, I wondered how long we would survive. We actually survived there almost 30 years. We had just moved back in 2010 to Bend, that area. But we were building, and Jerry, my husband, could get kind of grumpy at times, and he sent me down, I'm not sure what he was working on, but he sent me down to get a hacksaw, and he said, you know what a hacksaw is, don't you? And I said, oh, yeah, but I could be so intimidated. I mean, I used to run a big department, but no, I didn't know for sure what a hacksaw was. So I went down, and I got a hacksaw, and then I got one, which is sort of lower across here, and then I got one that looks like this. This actually came from a man in Florida. So this is Florida rattlesnake on here. So I brought both of them back, and I gave him the hacksaw, and he was happy. And so then I said, well, so what's this called? And he said, oh, that's a coping saw. And I said, you mean like I have trouble coping with you? That's a good mental health word, coping. And he said, yeah, it's the same word. And I said, well, what's it used for? And he said, well, it's used to fit things into tight places, like a cabinet into a corner, or the edge of a picture frame. And he said, if it's too tight, it'll splinter what you're trying to fit. And if it's too loose, it'll leave gaps. You have to have both strength and flexibility in order to cope. And he said it just like that, out there in the sagebrush. You know, it's like the Marlboro Man meets mental health. You know, it's just, and so I used that, almost that exact exchange. The poor man has to find our conversation sometimes in novels. I have this T-shirt someone gave me that said, "Be careful what you say, it could end up in my novel." But so I put this into a book called A Sweetness to the Soul about the Shear family of Shears Bridge. And a man from Florida read that book, and he sent me this, and he said, that coping style, he said, that's the kind of dad I want to be. I want to be strong, but not so strong I'm rigid. And it's the kind of husband I want to be. I want to be flexible, but not so flexible I can be walked all over. I want to be a coping kind of man. And I think our pioneering ancestors, like the Tabitha Moffett Brown and Marie Dorian and Emma Wagner-Giese and Jane Shear and all these incredible women I get to write about, Letitia Carson, who was one of the first African-American women, they knew how to cope. When I shared this one time, a man came up to me afterwards and he said, the other thing that a coping style allows you to do is to change directions quickly without a lot of friction. Isn't that a great metaphor? Wow. I thought, wow, is that? And we all know people who do not know how to change directions quickly without a lot of friction. And we meet them at the airport, you know, when the schedules have changed. It's like, no, you know. So coping to me is one of the critical capacities that in some ways marks who an Oregonian really is. Because we have to find ways to not keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result, and be able to change directions quickly without a lot of friction, to keep our community together, to keep exchanging those burdens, to face the challenges that we have, and there are many, and they're in our families, and they never go away, but to remember that they are what is carving our character. We know how to cope, and ultimately we know how to make a commitment. So I hope that you, as you think about your own ancestors and your own stories, that you will find those 5 qualities within them, and maybe even take the time to write them down so that the rest of us one day can read about your hardiness story and your persistence and your resilience. So thank you very much. How's that? And since we have time, do you have any questions? Yes.
Can you give me the 5 C words again?
Yes, the 5 C words are commitment, control, what you have control over and what you don't have control over, challenge, community, and coping. Yes. I should have like a little show and tell for each word, because that would be easier to remember, wouldn't it? Because you won't forget the coping, will you? No. Yeah. Coping style is hard to forget. So.
That's a good way to describe community.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Which book is Mary and Dorian?
So the Marie Dorian is a series of books, and the first one, and they have the first one out there, is called A Name of Her Own, and that's the journey that made them to, got them to Astoria, and also the story that most of us have heard about Marie Dorian, about keeping her children alive for 54 days, I think it was, in the Blue Mountains in January of 1814, and because of the whole party had been wiped out, and only she and the children survived. And she made her way from the Boise country up to what is around Milton Freewater, we think, and that's where she came out, and the Umatilla people rescued her at that point. But she stayed in the Northwest. Part of what had intrigued me about that story is that someone had suggested to me that I should write about Marie Dorian, and I had read a short version about that journey, and I said, well, it's sort of been done, you know. And then this gentleman said, no, well, there's some evidence that she knew Sacagawea or Sacagawea, but we say it Sacagawea. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what that would have been like. And so that began my journey to research to see whether they in fact could have known each other, or was there evidence for that? And there was evidence for that we could find in the historical record. And so here were 2 Indian women affiliated with white male fur trapping expeditions. They were both pregnant at the time of their journey, and I thought they must have had something to talk about. And they were together, we figure, about 45 days in the Mandan country.
In what country?
In the Mandan country, North Dakota.
Yes.
And the Astor party was heading west, and Sacagawea and her husband, Charbonneau, and a couple of other, I think it was a botanist and another, because they used to travel with these fur traders, and the fur trader was Manuel Lisa, and they came up from the south, and they both met in the Mandan country, where the Astorians were negotiating for horses, because they had decided not to follow the river route of Lewis and Clark, which was one of those poor decisions, ultimately. So that got me started, and then when I realized she stayed here, then I wanted to know more about what happened to her after that. And so the second book is called Every Fixed Star, and it's really about her, part of her life in the Walla Walla country and in the part of the Okanagan country, which is where she stayed. And then the third book is called Hold Tight the Thread, and that's when she made her way with her third husband and her children to the French Prairie country here. And she tells, we know about her because of a woman who was named Harriet Munich, who was passionate about translating the French priest records into English. And the St. Paul Historical Society in little St. Paul out there, they published, I think, 1,000 copies of those translations. There are 7 volumes, and I was able to find all 7, and then could track what was happening for Marie Dorian and where she was, and learn that she had been so revered here that she was buried beneath the altar of the Catholic Church. And as my Catholic friends say, even the priests are buried in the graveyard, and she was buried beneath the altar. So she was incredibly well regarded, and just a remarkable woman to spend any amount of time with, as far as I'm concerned. So, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your research process and resources and tools and things about how you?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, usually it starts with an unanswered question. John Wheeler is a physicist, and I read this quote from him one time. Someone asked him if he had any advice for young people who might be interested in physics. And he said, yes, tell them to find something strange and thoroughly explore it. And I think that's what I do. I find something strange and want to know more about that. And I usually go to the traditional sources. Initially, the first novel was about Jane and Joseph Shear and their life with the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute people. And I did census records. They had no children, so there weren't descendants. There were some nieces and nephews who had descendants that I was able to locate. But one of the things that opened up that story was that I worked at the time for the Confederated Tribes at Warm Springs. And one of my friends there said, no one has ever talked about the story from the native side. And so she arranged a dinner with some of the elders, and I had photographs of what Shears Bridge used to look like in that time. And one of the elders, his name was Olney Pat, but he started talking. He was a boy, and his parents had told him about the Shears. And I said, what do you remember? And he said, oh, he was a great man among my people. And I said, wow, that was like 150 years ago. Why do you think that carried down? That was the message of this man's life. And he said, well, he was a man of integrity. And he said he treated us with dignity and respect. And that was sort of an aha about how we live our lives makes a difference from one generation to the next. And then he said he couldn't pronounce our Indian names. So he gave us, because he paid for the labor to maintain that bridge and the road. If you've ever gone down into Ty Valley and crossed the Shears Bridge and gone up the other side, Bake Oven Road it's called, towards Shaniko. So he maintained that road and built that bridge that opened up settlement in Canyon City and the John Day area, which was at that point the second largest city in Oregon because of the gold rush. So he would pay them for their work. And he said he couldn't pronounce our names, so in the ledger book he gave us Irish names. And so he said my family name was given Patrick, and we shortened it to Pat. So 100 and some years later, his family was still. So that kind of thing. And then I feel like I just fall in to certain pieces of information that are, again, I think because of that commitment. And that particular book, I thought it was a great story, but I couldn't find anything out, or very little about her. One little essay that a man had written in the 1930s that had been republished in the Historical Society in Sherman County. But I went to I thought, my husband said, well, if you think it's a great story, you should just write it down. And if people don't like your version, they can write their own. But I had a lot of these disclaimers, it wasn't my family. I hadn't lived in that community for a long time, So anyway, I thought, well, when would I do this? And I thought, well, I was working, I was commuting, we had this ranch we were trying to start, and all I had been doing between 4 and 7 in the morning was sleeping. So I thought, I will make a commitment to set the alarm at 4, be at my computer by 5, and write for 2 hours. And that's, what did I know? I mean, I didn't know what it would take to write a book. So the next day we went to a Historical Society meeting in Little Rufus, and I sat next to a man, and he said, and what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm a writer. I had published my memoir called Homestead, but other than that, and he said, oh, what are you working on? And I said, I'm writing the story of Jane and Joseph Shear and their life with the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute people. And he said, oh, you should meet my cousin. And I said, why? And he said, well, she owns the property their original homestead was on, and I'm sure she'd let you walk there. So, I hadn't written a word yet, but I had done the hardest work because I'd made the commitment. And then, in every single book, something has happened that I could never have found out that piece of information. I wouldn't have gone looking there, and yet it just sort of came out. So, so it's odd places. I read a lot of nonfiction work, and when I keep finding the same kinds of storyline, I figure I probably have most of that. I really like to meet with descendants, if I can, because they, the family stories will help define that's what got remembered. Those are the important pieces that are remembered. I wrote a story based on one of the first teachers in South Florida, and she and her husband founded Fort Lauderdale. And we were there doing research and so on, and talking again to members of the Seminole Nation. And I found a book at the little local bookstore that was called My 50 Years of Hunting in the Everglades. And I always look for hunter and fisherman accounts of an area, of a landscape, because my husband is that, but I call him story impaired, because they tell the same story over and over and over again, exactly the same way, and they can tell that hunting story or whatever. Well, that's ideal for somebody like me, because that means when they write it down, it's probably pretty authentic for what happened in that time period. So here was a book that described what it looked like to see if an animal had moved through the sawgrass. It described how to find fresh water in the middle of the Everglades. I mean, it was just precious. So it's that, it's other people's work. It's a lot of nonfiction work. It's looking at documents, old maps. The book that's coming out this fall, All She Left Behind, is based on one of the first women to graduate from the Willamette University Medical School before Portland had a medical school. And I couldn't find out a lot about her. This was a descendant who said, I mentioned her and her second husband in another book, and that descendant 20 years ago said, that's my relative. And eventually that percoled up until last year I started doing more significant research. But I couldn't find out a lot about her, but because her second husband had been one of the first missionaries to come to Oregon, and is a big part of Oregon's history, Josiah Parrish, so that's a name that a lot of people know. He was at Champouie and so on. But because he was a Methodist, the records in the Methodist archives back in Philadelphia had tons of stuff. So you find other little places, and it had tons of stuff. It had her will, it had, programs from their children playing music at Willamette concerts, just wonderful little details of what everyday life might have been like for them. So it's that, and then when I've sort of pulled a lot of that together, I decide I do three things. I answer three questions, and these are from a book called Structuring Your Novel, so they're not unique to me, but I've found them really helpful as a practice. And the first question is, what's this story about? And that's basically when somebody says, what are you working on? This gentleman behind you here has written a number of novels, and I said, well, what's your book about? He could give me a one sentence, and that's exactly what it's called, the elevator sentence. You have one floor before the person has to get off when they say, what are you working on? Or their eyes glaze over, whatever. So that's the first one. What's my intention? What's the story about? The second is, what's my attitude about this story? And that really is, what do I feel deeply about? What matters to me? Why am I willing to give up my hours with my husband or my dog or whatever and spend time on this story? And then the third one is, what's my purpose in writing this story? And the corollary to that is, how do I hope a reader might be changed by the time they've finished reading this book? And I think these are good questions to ask if you're in a book club, to sort of say, what was the author's attitude here? What did they feel deeply about? Or, I wonder how did they hope I would feel differently or be changed? Because that's part of what a novel is about, is to change us, is to move us. To move us emotionally, or to move us to do something different. When people tell me they've planned their summer vacations by visiting some of the books I've written, I'm delighted that they're moved, to do that. And then I might take many pages to answer those questions, but I try to get it down to one sentence each, and then I post that in little tiny font on top of my computer, and then I start to write. And so when I get really lost, or I think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have written this book, maybe I should have, whatever, I can look back up there and keep myself focused on, this is what this book's about. This is why it mattered to me. And this is how I hope a reader might walk away from that. It's right next to the other little sign on my computer which says, you don't have time for that. And that's the Anne Lamott, message about not wasting our time listening to little harpies that tell us, whatever our dream is, whatever our commitment is, that it's not worth it. We don't have time for that because life is too short. So that's sort of my practice. And then my husband will tell you, when I come out of my office at some point and I say, and actually the first time this happened, I said, this is just the worst book ever. I cannot believe this is just crap. And he said, oh gosh, that's earlier in the process than usual. And I went, there was a process? I've said this before? So, but those three little things can help keep that going too. So, yeah. Yes?
How do you choose who you're going to write about?
That really varies too. It's sort of ups and downs. This particular story I had read, Tabitha wrote a letter that was published in a newspaper back east, and about the journey, a short letter, and it was included in a collection of works called Covered Wagon Women, that's edited by William Clark, I think it is, and it's diaries of women and letters and so on. So I had read this maybe 20 years ago, but a couple of years ago I was at the Lilac Gardens in Woodland, Washington, where I had written about Hulda Klager, and a woman came up and said, I drove here today because I'm with the Friends of Forest Grove, and we think your next book should be about Tabitha Moffett Brown. And it wasn't my next book, but it percolated up from to that point. Probably one of the, I get a lot of people who say, you should write about my great aunt or yada yada, and I always say, if that story calls my name, I know I would learn something about myself I otherwise never would have learned, but I wouldn't learn what you would learn if you wrote that story, because you're the keeper of that story. And then a couple of years ago, I had this woman here in the front, Janet, and her husband, John Miranda, and they, in the 1980s, Janet and a colleague Bob Zybeck. I always say Zybeck. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. They were researching something else at Oregon State and came across these court records of an African American woman who brought a lawsuit in Oregon at a time when Oregon was struggling with whether we were going to be a free or a slave state. There were exclusion laws. Technically, she wasn't even supposed to be in the territory. And a person of color could not testify against a white person during that time, so that she had brought a lawsuit and that she was able to win these lawsuits was pretty remarkable. And so they had begun doing research about her, and but one day they contacted me and said, we think you should write, we think this needs a novel. And I said what I always say, no, you should write. And Janet said, well, we're working on something, a biography or whatever, but we think it's a story because there's so many gaps. We think it really is a story that needs a novel to get it wider spread. And I fell in love with this woman. Her name was Letitia Carson. It was a phenomenal story of those 5 things: commitment and identifying what you have control over, and not letting the challenge define you, and looking at what your community was and creating your community. So, and coping. So that became A Light in the Wilderness, which is that actually won the Willow Literary Award. So her story has been more widely spread. And then Bob Zybeck has written a number of nonfiction pieces that currently are been published in the Southern Oregon Historical Review, and because that's where she ended up. She had been in the Corvallis area when it became Corvallis. And then Janet has just written a book that's like a prequel for young adult readers, and it's called
Freedom's Light.
Freedom's Light. So, and it's like what may have happened before we get to meet Letitia when she's a young woman in a common law married with a white man heading west from Missouri to Oregon. So that's how it comes up, and I have, since I sign contracts for 3 books at a time, I have to convince my publisher that these 3 stories will be the next 3. I think they'd let me change it if one came up that I just couldn't let go of, but so far it's, been that kind of sequentially. So, yeah. So you'll get the one this fall is another Salem, real specific Salem kind of story. So, and Portland. All right, thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.